There is a version of James Longstreet that the post-war South spent 40 years constructing, and it goes like this. He was slow at Gettysburg. He disobeyed orders. He cost the Confederacy the battle that could have won the war. Robert E. Lee trusted him, and he failed Lee, and the Confederacy paid for that failure in blood and in defeat. That version has statues behind it. It has the Southern Historical Society behind it. It has the organized, deliberate, decades-long labor of men like Jubal Early, who had their own reasons for needing someone to blame behind it. And for most of the period between 1870 and the mid-20th century, it had something even more powerful behind it, the silence of the dead. Lee died in October of 1870. He never publicly blamed Longstreet for Gettysburg. He accepted general responsibility for the defeat in his official report, distributed credit and fault so evenly across the record that no single subordinate was singled out, and said almost nothing in public about the specific decisions of July 2nd and July 3rd that might have pointed a finger at anyone in particular. But Lee did not die without leaving a private record, and that private record, documented in the notes of a former Confederate officer named William Allan, who sat with Lee in private conversations in 1868 and wrote down what he said, tells a story that the Lost Cause faction could not have used even if they had wanted to, because it is too complicated, because it does not give them the clean villain they needed. Because what Lee actually said about Longstreet in private was not what Jubal Early spent 30 years claiming Lee believed. This video is about the gap between those two things, between what Lee said and what history claimed he said, between the general who called Longstreet his old war horse and the mythology that turned that same man into the scapegoat for the Confederacy's greatest defeat, and between the version of Longstreet that the Lost Cause buried and the one the full record, read honestly, reveals. If this kind of history finds you, hit like and subscribe. It helps keep this channel going. James Longstreet was born in January of 1821 in Edgefield District, South Carolina, and grew up in Georgia. He was a large man, 6'2", broad-shouldered, physically imposing in a way that his photographs communicate even across a century and a half. He graduated from West Point in 1842, 54th in a class of 62, which placed him near the bottom in the same way that Pickett's last-place finish would later be treated as evidence of something essential. In Longstreet's case, as in Pickett's, the class rank tells you almost nothing useful. He served in the Mexican War and was wounded at Chapultepec, the same assault where a young George Pickett would carry the regimental flag over the wall a few moments later. He received 2 brevets for gallantry. He came home from Mexico as a man who had been in serious combat and had not broken, which was the only credential that ultimately mattered in the war that was coming. He spent the interwar years in the army, mostly on the frontier, and by 1861 was a lieutenant colonel and paymaster, a comfortable administrative position that he resigned when Alabama and Georgia seceded, following his adopted state rather than his birth state, which was a distinction that mattered more to some men than others. He received a brigadier general's commission from the Confederacy and was given a brigade. What made Longstreet different from the officers around him was not immediately obvious in 1861. He was not flamboyant. He did not cultivate the romantic persona that men like Pickett and Stuart brought to the war. He was methodical, deliberate, and harder to read than most generals on either side, qualities that his subordinates sometimes mistook for slowness, and his enemies would later weaponize into a character indictment. What he was, at bottom, was a defensive tactician of the First Order. He understood, earlier and more clearly than almost any other senior officer in the Confederate Army, that the tactical conditions of Civil War combat favored the defense over the offense by a margin that commanders were systematically refusing to acknowledge. Rifled muskets had extended the effective range of infantry fire. Fieldworks could be constructed quickly and held by smaller forces against much larger attacking ones. The mathematical relationship between the attackers needed to overrun a prepared defensive position, and the casualties those attackers would take in the process made frontal assaults against good ground almost suicidal. Longstreet saw this. He said so repeatedly to anyone who would listen. And the tension between what he saw clearly and what the army around him refused to see is the engine that drives the entire story of the Lee-Longstreet relationship, not just at Gettysburg, but across 3 years of a war that increasingly confirmed what Longstreet had argued from the beginning. The irony is that this same man, the one who understood the murderous arithmetic of frontal assault, was at his most effective when executing exactly the kind of offensive strike he spent his career arguing against. Second Bull Run, Chickamauga, the Wilderness. The moments in the war where Longstreet is at his absolute best are almost always offensive moments. He just wanted them to be his choice, not someone else's order. Lee recognized something in Longstreet that the historical record supports clearly. He was the most reliable corps commander in the Army of Northern Virginia, not the most brilliant, not the most spectacular. Jackson was more spectacular, more celebrated, more mythologized even before his death. But Longstreet was the one Lee called his old war horse. The one he leaned on when the situation was desperate, and he needed a corps commander who would be exactly where he was supposed to be and do exactly what needed to be done. The nickname, Old War Horse, is not a small thing. It is the most affectionate thing Lee called any of his subordinates in the documented record. It appears in multiple accounts from the war years, consistently attributed, consistently carrying the same quality of deep professional affection that Lee expressed almost nowhere else. It is the language of a man who trusts someone completely. And it makes what happened after the war considerably harder to explain, unless you understand who was doing the explaining and why. The Army of Northern Virginia crossed into Pennsylvania in late June of 1863 with approximately 75,000 men. Lee was looking for a decisive engagement on Northern soil, something that would demonstrate Confederate military power in a way that might produce foreign recognition or break Northern civilian morale ahead of the 1864 elections. The strategic logic, such as it was, required winning in Pennsylvania. And winning in Pennsylvania required Lee to fight the kind of aggressive offensive battle that Longstreet had been arguing against for the entire war. The battle began accidentally on July 1st, when Confederate infantry advancing toward Gettysburg for supplies encountered Union cavalry west of the town. By the end of the day, after savage fighting through the streets of Gettysburg, Union forces had been driven back to the high ground south of town, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. The Union Army held elevated ground with its flanks anchored on defensible terrain. That evening, Longstreet surveyed the position and made the recommendation that he would spend the rest of his life arguing was correct. He told Lee to disengage, move south and east, get between Meade's army and Washington, select strong defensive ground, and let the Union Army come to them. The Confederates had the strategic leverage. Meade could not allow a Confederate army to sit between him and the capital and the defensive advantage. Let the Union Army beat itself against Confederate positions rather than the other way around. Lee declined. He intended to attack the next morning. Longstreet's response to this decision is documented in his own account and in the accounts of staff officers who were present. He did not refuse to obey. He did not threaten insubordination. He expressed his disagreement, received Lee's decision, and began making the preparations his orders required. That distinction between expressing professional disagreement and failing to execute is the one the Lost Cause faction would spend decades trying to collapse. July 2nd is the most contested day in the entire history of Gettysburg, which is saying something considerable. Longstreet's corps, Hood's division, and McLaws' division was ordered to attack the Union left flank. The attack went in late afternoon, several hours later than Lee had intended. The delay would become the central charge against Longstreet in the post-war years. What caused the delay is a question Civil War historians have been arguing about since, before the smoke cleared from the field. The operational requirements of moving a corps into attack position without being spotted by Union signal observers on Little Round Top, observers who could see Confederate movements across miles of open countryside, required a countermarch that consumed most of the morning. Whether that countermarch was executed as quickly as it could have been, or whether Longstreet's personal resistance to the plan caused deliberate slowness, is genuinely disputed. Historians as serious as Gary Gallagher, who has no particular sympathy for lost cause distortions, believe Longstreet bears some responsibility for the timing. Jeffrey Wirt, whose biography of Longstreet is the definitive modern scholarly account, is more sympathetic. Neither has settled the question, and anyone who tells you it is settled is telling you something the historiography does not support. What is documented is what happened when the attack finally went in. Hood's division, attacking on the right, reached and briefly contested Little Round Top, the anchor of the entire Union left. The peach orchard was taken. The wheat field became one of the bloodiest small-scale engagements of the war. The Union line bent severely, nearly broke, and held by the thinnest of margins at several points simultaneously. Whether earlier timing would have produced a different result is a counterfactual no one can resolve. On July 3rd, Lee ordered Pickett's charge. Longstreet opposed it explicitly, and here the documentation is clearer than almost anywhere else in the Gettysburg controversy. His account, written after the war, describes telling Lee directly that no 15,000 men who ever lived could take the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. That the ground was wrong, the distance was wrong, the Union artillery was intact and waiting, and the assault would not succeed. Lee heard him. Lee proceeded. When the formal order was given, Longstreet, by his own account, could not speak the command. He nodded. That nod sent approximately 12 to 15,000 men across a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland into some of the most concentrated artillery and musket fire of the entire war. When the survivors came back, roughly half of them did not come back at all. Lee met the returning men near his command position and told them, documented in multiple accounts, that it was all his fault, that the men had done their duty and the fault was his alone. What Lee said directly to Longstreet that afternoon is less clearly documented. Their interaction as the battle ended is recorded in fragments in the accounts of staff officers who were present without the verbal precision that a historian would want. What is documented is that Lee did not relieve Longstreet, did not file any formal complaint about his conduct, did not write anything in the subsequent months that placed public blame on Longstreet for the defeat. The official report on Gettysburg, filed by Lee in January of 1864, distributed responsibility so broadly that no specific subordinate was singled out for criticism. Longstreet's name appears in it without any language of censure. If Lee blamed Longstreet specifically for the defeat, he did not say so in any document he chose to put into the official record. In February and March of 1868, 2.5 years after Appomattox, 2 years before Lee's death, a former Confederate officer named William Allan visited Lee at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, where Lee was serving as president. Allan was working on his own account of the war and sat with Lee in private conversations over the course of several visits. He took notes. Those notes survive. What Lee told Allan about Gettysburg is the closest thing we have to Lee's actual private verdict on what went wrong, and it is more complex than either the lost cause mythology or Longstreet's own account would suggest. Lee told Allan, in substance, that Longstreet had been slow, that the attack on July 2nd had not gone in as early as he had intended, that if the attack had been delivered earlier in the day, the result might have been different. This is a genuine criticism. It is documented. It should not be minimized. But the Allan notes also show a Lee who is working through the battle honestly, acknowledging his own decisions, not producing the clean verdict against Longstreet that Early and his allies would later claim Lee believed. Lee does not tell Allan that Longstreet disobeyed orders. He does not say Gettysburg was lost because of Longstreet's failures alone. He describes a battle where things went wrong at multiple levels, and where Longstreet's timing on July 2nd was one of them. There is another document that sits alongside the Allan notes and complicates the picture further. William Pendleton, Lee's chief of artillery, gave a speech in 1873, 3 years after Lee's death, in which he claimed that Lee had given Longstreet an explicit order the night of July 1st to attack at sunrise on July 2nd, and that Longstreet had disobeyed this order. This claim became one of the foundational accusations of the Lost Cause campaign against Longstreet. Longstreet denied it absolutely, and the mainstream of Civil War historiography including scholars who have no particular brief for Longstreet, has largely rejected Pendleton's account. There is no documentary evidence of a sunrise order. No staff officer corroborates it. No dispatch, no written instruction, no entry in Lee's correspondence supports it. Jeffrey Wirt's biography examines the claim closely and finds it unsupported. Gary Gallagher, who is not an uncritical defender of Longstreet, does not accept the sunrise order as documented fact. What Pendleton was doing in 1873 was building a case using Lee's posthumous authority for a claim that Lee had never made publicly during his lifetime. He was putting words in a dead man's mouth and calling it history. That pattern, using Lee's name to authorize a verdict Lee had never publicly delivered, is the defining strategy of the entire Lost Cause campaign against Longstreet, and it worked because Lee was dead and could not contradict it. Jubal Early understood this clearly. His systematic campaign against Longstreet through the Southern Historical Society, the articles, the speeches, the organized coordination of testimony from former Confederate officers, was built on the premise that the Lost Cause needed a villain, and Longstreet had made himself available for the role by going public with his criticisms of Lee's Gettysburg decisions at a moment when the South was not prepared to hear them. Early had his own reasons. His military record in the final year of the war was not one he wanted examined closely. His defeat at Cedar Creek in October 1864, the subsequent disaster of his entire Valley campaign against Sheridan, were the kind of failures that a man with Early's ego found it useful to redirect attention away from. The Longstreet controversy gave him something else to talk about, something he could organize around. Something that made him the defender of Lee's honor rather than the general whose army Sheridan had destroyed in the Shenandoah. What happened to Longstreet after the war is worth understanding in full, because the scale of it is easy to miss when it's described in summary. He was not simply criticized, he was systematically dismantled. He had made himself a target by the choices he made in the immediate post-war years. He supported Reconstruction, not with reluctance, not with the careful, hedged language that former Confederates who wanted to maintain standing in Southern society deployed, but openly. He joined the Republican Party. He accepted federal appointments under Ulysses Grant, who had been his friend before the war and remained his friend after it. He publicly stated his view that the South had been wrong to secede and that the war's outcome was the right one. In the post-war South, these positions were not merely controversial. They were unforgivable, and the men who had spent the war losing to Grant were not inclined to look charitably on a former Confederate general who now called Grant his friend and took offices from his administration. What turned the personal antagonism into a historical campaign was the memoir. When Longstreet began publishing his account of the war in articles and eventually in his 1896 book From Manassas to Appomattox, he said clearly what he had always said privately, that Gettysburg had been lost because Lee had overruled his strategic advice on July 1st and ordered an assault on July 3rd against Longstreet's explicit objection. He named Lee. He described their disagreements in specific terms. He said, in the clearest possible language, that the standards of the time permitted, that he had been right and Lee had been wrong. This was not acceptable, not in the South of the 1870s and 1880s, where Lee had completed his transformation into a secular saint, the marble general, the embodiment of Confederate honor and Southern identity, the man whose memory was the one pure thing left from a catastrophic defeat. To say Lee had made mistakes at Gettysburg was one thing. Many former Confederates had said as much in careful, deferential terms. To say Lee had been wrong when Longstreet had been right, and to say it in print, under your own name, while accepting offices from the Republican government, that was something else. Early and his allies went to work. The Southern Historical Society papers published article after article establishing the narrative that became orthodoxy. Longstreet had been ordered to attack at sunrise on July 2nd. He had refused. His delay had cost Lee the battle. The war's outcome rested on his failure. Everything else, the Republican politics, the federal appointments, the public criticisms of Lee, was evidence of a character that had always been flawed, a man who had never been worthy of the trust Lee placed in him. What they built was not history. It was a legal brief for a verdict that the evidence did not fully support, argued before a jury that wanted to believe it. The monuments tell the story as clearly as the documents. In Gettysburg, the monument to Longstreet came more than a century after the battle, dedicated in 1998, one of the last senior Confederate commanders to receive one, and placed in a location that ensured it would never be the kind of central memorial presence that Lee's statues commanded. Longstreet is on horseback in the trees at the edge of the battlefield. Looking at the ground, he argued against attacking, positioned by the park authorities in a spot that is, by design or by habit, harder to find than almost any other monument on the field. He outlived them all. Lee died in 1870. Jackson had died in 1863. Pickett died in 1875. Early died in 1894. Longstreet died in January of 1904 at the age of 82, having spent the last 3 decades of his life fighting a version of history that had been built specifically to erase him. His last years were not quiet. He was in a carriage accident. He developed eye cancer. He lost the sight in one eye. He remarried in 1897, a woman 34 years younger named Helen Dortch, and the marriage scandalized what remained of Confederate Veterans Society, adding one more item to the list of things Longstreet had done that respectable Southern opinion could not forgive. He kept writing. He kept giving interviews. He kept saying what he had always said, that he had been right at Gettysburg, that Lee had overruled him, that the charge on July 3rd had been a mistake, and that none of this diminished what Lee had been or what the Army of Northern Virginia had accomplished. He was not trying to destroy Lee's reputation. He was trying to insert his own account into a historical record that had been constructed without him. He succeeded only partially. By the time he died, the lost cause version of Gettysburg was so deeply embedded in Confederate memory and in popular American history that Longstreet's own testimony was read as self-serving rather than as evidence. The man who had been there, who had argued against the charge before it happened, who had commanded the corps that came closest to breaking the Union line on July 2nd, that man's account was treated as less reliable than the accounts of men who were pushing a narrative assembled after the fact for purposes that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The rehabilitation of Longstreet's historical reputation is largely a 20th century project, and it is still incomplete in the popular imagination, even though the scholarly consensus has shifted substantially. What the serious historiography now supports, taken together, is something like this. Longstreet was probably slow on July 2nd by Lee's intentions, if not necessarily by the operational requirements of the situation. The Allan notes support Lee's private view that earlier action might have produced different results. That is a real criticism, documented in a real primary source, and it should not be erased in the process of defending Longstreet against the excesses of the lost cause. But the Sunrise Order that Pendleton claimed and Early built his case on is not supported by the documentary record. The systematic campaign against Longstreet was conducted by men with personal and political axes to grind, using Lee's posthumous authority for claims Lee had never publicly made. The version of Longstreet that entered popular history, the deliberate saboteur, the man who lost the war for the Confederacy, is a construct, not a historical finding. And the man himself, the actual James Longstreet, read across the full arc of his military career, was something considerably more than the lost cause needed him to be. He was the General Lee called his old war horse, the man whose corps executed the flank attack at Second Bull Run that shattered Pope's army, the man whose breakthrough at Chickamauga produced one of the Confederacy's most complete tactical victories, the man who was shot by his own troops at the Wilderness at the moment his attack was threatening to turn the battle, an eerie echo of Jackson at Chancellorsville, except that Longstreet survived it, came back 5 months later with his voice permanently altered by the throat wound, and served through Petersburg and Appomattox without complaint. At Appomattox, on April 9, 1865, Grant came to accept Lee's surrender. He passed Longstreet on the way in and stopped. The two men had been friends before the war. Grant asked Longstreet if he thought the old times would ever come back. Longstreet said he supposed they would, if Grant worked for it. Grant laughed. That exchange, two men on opposite sides of the most devastating war in American history, finding their way back to a friendship that the war had interrupted but not ended, is the human grace note the lost cause wanted to deny Longstreet. The enemy general found his way to the man. The Southern historical establishment spent 30 years trying to forget that Longstreet was worth finding. The question the lost cause could never answer cleanly was this: if Longstreet was the failure they claimed, why did Lee keep him? Why, after Gettysburg, did Lee continue to rely on Longstreet as his most trusted corps commander? Why, when Longstreet returned from the Wilderness Wound in October 1864, did Lee place him immediately back in command of the First Corps rather than reassigning him to a lesser role? The lost cause answer, that Lee was too loyal, too gentlemanly, too committed to the culture of the officer corps to relieve a subordinate he had lost faith in, does not survive contact with the record of a general who reorganized his entire army after Jackson's death, who managed the removal of difficult subordinates when the situation required it, and who was not, by any credible historical account, a man paralyzed by sentimentality in his command decisions. Lee kept Longstreet because Lee trusted Longstreet. The old war horse designation was not nostalgia. It was a professional judgment that Lee maintained across 3 years of war, across Gettysburg, across the Wilderness, to the very end at Appomattox. What Lee said privately in 1868, that Longstreet had been slow on July 2nd, that earlier action might have helped, was a specific criticism of a specific operational decision. It was not a verdict on Longstreet as a commander. It was not the sweeping condemnation that Early and Pendleton built their case around. It was one general's honest private assessment of a moment in a battle that had gone wrong in multiple places simultaneously. History buried that nuance because nuance did not serve what the lost cause needed. The lost cause needed a clean villain. Gettysburg needed a single cause. Lee's memory needed to be protected from any reading of the battle that made his decisions the primary explanation for the defeat. Longstreet was available, was politically convenient, and had made himself an enemy of the men who controlled the narrative. So they gave him the bill. James Longstreet is buried in Alta Vista Cemetery in Gainesville, Georgia. The headstone is modest. The grave does not have the kind of pilgrimage traffic that marks Confederate memory in Virginia and elsewhere. He is not the center of the Lost Cause mythology because the Lost Cause mythology was built specifically to exclude him. But the record he left, in his own letters, in his memoir, in the accounts of the men who served under him, in the operational history of every battle where his corps was engaged, is the most complete rebuttal of the verdict against him that any general could have asked for. Not because it is perfect, not because it resolves every disputed question about July 2nd at Gettysburg or the delay or the countermarch, but because it shows, across 3 years of war and dozens of engagements, a general of the First Order who understood the war he was fighting more clearly than most of the men around him, and who had the specific misfortune of being right at Gettysburg in a way that the Confederacy could not afford to acknowledge. Lee called him his old war horse and relied on him from the 7 days to Appomattox. The private record, read honestly in the Allan notes, shows Lee's specific criticism of the July 2nd timing alongside a broader professional trust that never wavered. The public record shows Lee accepting full responsibility for Gettysburg without ever naming Longstreet as the cause. The lost cause turned that silence into an accusation. It took what Lee never said publicly and built from it a case that Lee's authority was supposed to validate, but that Lee's own documented words, read carefully, do not support. What Lee said that history buried was not a verdict against Longstreet. It was a private assessment, specific and partial, that the men who needed a villain were never going to find sufficient for their purposes. So they invented something larger, something cleaner, something that required Longstreet to be the reason the Confederacy lost instead of one general whose timing on one afternoon in Pennsylvania did not meet his commanding officer's intentions. Longstreet spent 30 years saying this. He said it in interviews and in print, and in the memoir that Confederate Veterans Societies condemned before they read it. He said it with his voice altered by the wound he had taken at the Wilderness, pressing forward through his own lines at the moment his attack was turning the battle, the wound that proved, if proof were needed, that whatever Longstreet was, he was not a man afraid to be where the fighting was. He was right, he was inconvenient, and the version of him that history buried was the version Lee actually knew. The man Lee called his old war horse. Not the scapegoat, the war horse.